the Hudson Library and Historical Society's Through the Eyes of the Artist series. Presents art historian Felicia Zavarella Stadelman, speaking about American children's author, political cartoonist, poet, animator, screenwriter, filmmaker, and artist Dr Seuss Geisel, more commonly known by his pen name, Dr. Seuss. Creator of over 60 Dr. Seuss series books, some of the most popular children's books of all time, selling over 600 million copies and translated into more than 20 languages. Some of the most famous children's books, such as Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, and many more, were all written and illustrated by this one wonderfully created man. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on September 12, 2018.
Good evening, welcome. Thank you all for joining us as we continue Through the Eyes of the Artist with Felicia Stadelman. I'd like to thank you all for your continued support in the program and interest. Felicia's been one of our more popular speakers here at the library, and we've happily hosted her program here for 5 years. If you would please join me in welcoming our local art historian, Felicia Zavarella Stadelman. Tonight I think we're in for a treat because this is a little bit different lecture than she's done in the past. We normally hear about all the European painters, and we have the pleasure of having the lecture tonight on the American artist and cartoonist and illustrator Dr. Seuss Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. So please join me in welcoming Felicia.
I half expected somebody to come with a hat. Nobody has. Is it in your purse or something? So on an autumn morning in 1991, we were all awakened by this sober-voiced radio announcer who said, the children's book author, Dr. Seuss, has died last night in California. And the page one obituary of the New York Times was headlined, Dr. Seuss, modern Mother Goose, dies at 87. USA had this bold print, Dr. Seuss, 1904 to 1991. But you had to read the fine print to learn about Ted Geisel, Theodore Geisel of Springfield, Massachusetts. And even then, you didn't learn very much because Ted Geisel kind of plays a supporting role to Dr. Seuss. Probably no other American has been so totally subsumed by an alter ego like Dr. Seuss has. And to the wide world, Ted Geisel was basically a stranger. Did anybody know that that was his name? A few of you did. But he was teachers, yeah. He was completely anonymous to the rest of us. Dr. Seuss, on the other hand, was well known to all. He wrote and illustrated children's books that sold more than 200 million copies in 20 different languages. He created characters as famous as anything that you could put together. The Cat in the Hat, Thing 1 and Thing 2, Horton, the Yertle the Turtle, the Grinch. I'm going through these and I'm sure you're seeing them in your head. He also won 2 Academy Awards and a Pulitzer. Did you know those things? Keeping track, 5 new things. So more important, he helped teach millions of people to read. The art of Dr. Seuss and his artistic vision emerged as the golden thread that linked every facet of his career. His artwork became the platform from which he delivered 44 children's books, political cartoons, hundreds of advertisements filled with wonderfully inventive animals and characters, and of course, humor. The long-lost manuscript from the beloved author and illustrator Dr. Seuss was released in 2015, making a quarter-century swan song for the artist. Oh, the places you'll go empowered us to move mountains. What Pet Should I Get arrived July 28th, 2 years after the author's widow unearthed the story in a number of sketches and words. She didn't even know about them. There were 16 pages of black and white sketches that had text taped to the pages, as he always did. He'd make the sketch and then from his typewriter cut it out and paste it on the page. But it's not clear why he never published these stories or what he had planned to do with it. But when they put all the pages together, the publisher found that there was enough material for a complete book, and it featured the siblings on a trip to the pet store, which we know is never a sensible thing to do in a Dr. Seuss book. Philip Nell, who is the author of Dr. Seuss, An American Icon, and Guy McLean, director of the Wood Museum of Springfield History, believe that his advertising beginnings led him into the Zooks and the Zoomers and the crazy characters, pulling children's literature away from that book, that tisk-tisk book, Dick and Jane, and obliterated the boring belief that young readers have to be prim and proper. So I'm going to start out by just telling you a few things that you don't know. Things about Dr. Seuss. Putting this slide together, this slide presentation together, PowerPoint slide presentation, that really dates me, was a joy because the graphics were a blast. Okay, thing one, he got a sense of humor from his mother. Theodore Ted Seuss Geisel was born on March 2nd, 1904, in Springfield, Massachusetts, and years before his middle name became synonymous with the rhyming whimsy in children's books, Seuss was his mother's maiden name, and he credited his mother with inspiring these rhymes for him. Henrietta Seuss would chant softly to her children at bedtime the rhymes that she memorized from her time working in her father's bakery selling pies, and they would sell pies with whimsical rhyming songs. Seuss later said that more than anyone else, his mother was responsible for the rhyming which he wrote and the urgency in which he did it, because it was the vernacular and the verbiage that he grew up with, these rhymes. Thing number two, he never had any biological children. When asked why he had no children of his own, he said, "You make them, I'll amuse them. They scare me." He wrote his first children's book, an unpublished ABC book of creatures, around 1931. Around the same time, his wife, Helen Palmer, learned that she could not biologically carry any children. And so it was a disappointment, but he was a bit relieved, he said. She said, "I don't think it's really a coincidence." In some ways, many biographers believe that he wrote to children because he felt the need to speak to them, but he could not do it on his own since he didn't have any. Now, after Helen died in 1967, he eventually remarried Audrey Diamond, who had 2 daughters, and so he had his children there. In more than 40 books, his name, including The Cat in the Hat and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, carried all these strange vehicles and animals, and nonsense was the author's way to communicate in general with children. Unlike those Dick and Jane books that preached the Victorian morals, his stories didn't tell the children how to behave. He simply made literature a lot more fun. So when you compare the cat's chaos, the lines to the lines of Dick and Jane, look, look, oh, see, Jane. The made-up words and the incessant rhymes did not diminish the message or dampen any of the story of, for example, the Sneetchers, the anti-discrimination story, or the Lorax's environmental message. He took children very seriously, and he wanted to teach them. When he was asked about writing for children, he said, "I don't write for children, I write for people." So, thing number 3, the pen name Dr. Seuss began as a way to escape punishment from college. In the midst of the Prohibition era, he and his friends were caught drinking gin in his dorm. And as punishment, he was stripped of editorship for the college humor magazine Jack-O-Lantern. Was not allowed to draw the cartoons any longer. However, he continued to publish his work under a variety of pseudonyms, including T. Seuss and a variety of other things like Dr. Seuss, and eventually he shortened it to Dr. Seuss, which was his go-to professional name. Now, in 1961, he wrote 10 Apples on Top, and he began collaborating with other illustrators who were, of course, himself, but since he wasn't allowed to use that name, he was being punished from college, he used a variety of different pseudonyms like Theo Lesieg, L-E-S-I-E-G, which is Giesel spelled backwards. And that was some of the illustrators. He also published the book in 1975, Because a Little Bug Went Ka-Choo, under the name Rosetta Stone. He debuted The Cat in the Hat and The Grinch the same year in 1957, two of his most famous characters. And incidentally, did you know that The Cat and the Grinch were facets of the man himself? The rule-breaking, mischievous cat spoke about Seuss's sense of play, while the Grinch represented that cantankerous part of Seuss's personality that always remained. He actually had a vanity license plate that said Grinch. Now, in 1941, he joined the war effort, and he produced political cartoons for the left-wing newspaper, PM in New York. And by 1942, he was very keen on joining the Navy, but he instead made war propaganda films with the Oscar-winning director Frank Capra, joined by P.D. Eastman of Eastman Kodak fame, and Mel Blanc, and Chuck Jones, among others, were the people that he conspired with to make these films. This is way before the books came. This is 1941. Now, by 1942, he wanted to join the Navy, but he hadn't at that point. So he created this private snafu. Google this. It's so worth seeing this cartoon. It's available on YouTube. And it's a cartoon character in a military uniform meant to teach new recruits how to be a good soldier. And it's a black and white cartoon, but it's a little off color. And it hit the soldiers really well. For example, one of the comments in there is, "It's so cold it would freeze the nuts off your Jeep." He ended up writing a number of biting political cartoons during World War II, including one that was condemning American indifference to the deaths of foreign children. He's had surprisingly strong positions on this isolationist political climate in the U.S. as World War II began. Among his works, this cartoon shows eerily a self-satisfied mother wearing a sweater bearing the legend America First, reads a book called Adolf the Wolf to two horrified, saucer-eyed children, telling them how the wolf would chew up the children and spit out their bones. And these were foreign children, so it didn't really matter, is the interpretation he had in this cartoon. Remember, it's a political cartoon, and it was meant to criticize this alienation that was created. Interesting how it could be appropriate even in today's times. All right, thing 5. He was a successful ad man before he became a children's author. His first foray into literature was, and to think that I saw that on Mulberry Street in 1937. And before that, he had a successful career in advertising. He wrote copy and he drew advertisements for companies like Standard Oil and Flit Bug Spray, which in particular became his most important work. They advertised on the bug spray that included DDT. Seuss had his first taste of contributing to the American vernacular when the phrase, "Quick, Henry, get the flit," from one of his ads became very popular. The ad campaign was such a hit that he continued to pursue this with these two companies for 17 years. What he said was, the only good thing about Adolf Hitler in starting World War II was that it finally enabled me to join the army and stop drawing Quick Henry the Flit cartoons. How about thing number 6? Remember Bennett Cerf from that TV show where you'd asked all those questions? He was actually the founder of Random House, and he bet Dr. Seuss that he couldn't write a book using only 50 words. The result was Green Eggs and Ham. Although the cat and the Grinch are among his most iconic characters, the story of Sam I Am trying to convince an unknown character to eat green eggs and ham sold more than 10 million copies. So give it a try. Go home tonight, pick 50 words, or the 50 words, you can look up which words those were, and try to write a story around that. All right, thing 7. He also gifted the English language with the word nerd. Didn't exist between Seuss. That's another one. I know that's another one to our fact. He also redefined the word Grinch as kind of a crabby person. In the 1950s, if I ran the zoo, this kid rattles off a list of fantastical creatures that rival the other animals that are in the zoo. And he said, I'll sail to Catrue and bring back a Kichu, a Preep, a Prue, a Nurgle, a Nerd, and a Seersucker too. That's when the word was first introduced. So the nerd is this character, a red and yellow, white-haired sourpuss. And it appears to be the very first documented instance of the word nerd, which has since morphed into a put-down for bookish people. He did not invent Grinch, but he did always insinuate that it was a grouchy person, and it was the grouchy person within him. So he actually changed our language, although Nurgle never really caught on. All right, thing 8. Did anybody know he created these adult books? The 7 Ladies Godivas. These are true facts concerning history's barest family. I think we need to get this in the library. It was a flop when it came out in 1939. It featured these unclothed sisters throughout the book, and it was a decidedly unsexy story. And he said that I thought it was a flop because I couldn't draw sexy naked babes. They looked absurd. And at that point, it's pretty true because the book is not very erotic. Now, on subsequent reissues, there was a claim that Lady Godiva's was reissued by a multitudinous demand, which is a lie because nobody wanted the book and it never really sold. But it was an interesting failure. On the other hand, he created another adult book called You're Only Old Once. And it was published in 1986 about the indignities of growing older. I love the cartoon about taking the pills and the pinkies. Dr. Seuss, incidentally, was never a doctor. He didn't earn a doctorate, not a doctor at all. He used it as part of his name because his father always wanted him to become a doctor. And number 10, he had a secret life, the cat behind the hat. It shows the side to most of his readers who are familiar with his graphics in children's books, paintings and art that no one's ever seen. These midnight paintings, which I'll show you a little later, along with significant drawings and sculpture, were created by Dr. Seuss, but never exhibited during his lifetime. He always asked his wife Audrey to wait until he was gone before he brought these works to public because he was afraid of what people would think of them. In preface to the popular coffee table book in his collection, The Cat Behind the Hat, she said, "I'm gratified to carry out Ted's wishes. These works revealed the true Ted Geisel to the world." So let's take a look at the real Ted Geisel. These are some of the mystery paintings. Secret life. So this is how he was described. He was an amiable, considerate, private, sometimes insecure man. He lived his adult life in La Jolla, California, on a mountaintop near the Pacific shore. And by disposition, he was always very reserved. Dry-wit New Englander is how they described him, and that was natural to him because that's how he grew up, in Massachusetts, where he was born and bred. He also attended college in New Hampshire. Now, New England, in fact, was the first place where he existed only as Ted Geisel. By the time he graduated from Dartmouth College in 1925, and excited to enter into the larger world and study at Oxford after graduation and then to New York City and California, he was already carrying that Seussonym, his extra personality. So who was Theodore? In the first decade of the century, in a little town called Springfield in the western part of Massachusetts, that city personified the American industrial dream. And it was set in the lush and lovely Connecticut River Valley. It was a vital thing, an engine hitting on all cylinders, blowing off steam, churning out products, making money. And in this town, May 2nd, 1904, a boy, Theodore, was born to a prosperous clan of beer barons known as the Geisels. Now, his father, Robert, was born in 1879, and he kept his home where he lived as a child for quite a while. It was near the Geisel breweries, and eventually he marries Henrietta Seuss, who was Ted's mother in 1901. Now, Theodore Robert Geisel was a tall, straight-backed man, black hair, mustache, athletic and strong, and he developed an interest in target shooting since his days in Springfield, and Springfield was the leading gun manufacturer in the U.S. at the time, so he received a very high level as an expert marksman. And in 1902, he held the world title for 200 yards. Now, his mother was the daughter of Bavarian immigrants, and at the age of 15, she she gave up her hope of attending college, and she started working in the family bakery. That was her calling. So that kind of thwarted her desire to go to college and made her intent on making sure that her children later on were able to acquire a higher education that she was never able to get. So his parents shared this love of the outdoors. His mom also had an astonishing aptitude with firearms. At 6 feet and nearly 200 pounds, his mother, she was large and strong and very pretty. She was a crack shot, and she would match her husband trophy for trophy with the shooting. Now, Ted was the second born in the Geisel family, 2 years younger than Margarita. She was affectionately called Marnie by her family, and she had a very close relationship with Ted while they grew up together. She was tall and pretty. She always took her younger brother's hand as they walked to school and played tennis in Forest Park where they lived. And they would enjoy dressing in costume. Ted always went to the birthday parties that his mother held for him dressed as some character. She played the piano, was very studious. She took schoolwork more seriously than Ted did. She graduated magna cum laude from Central High School and later attended Smith College in Northampton. Now, every morning, Ted's father would go to target practice in the 700-acre forest park that was near their home. And Ted would go along and help with the targets, and then eventually he would steal off and sketch the animals. He said, I was always dreaming and always drawing with pencils, crayons, or anything I could get my hands on. And nearly always it was animals, he said, goofy-looking ones. My mother overindulged me by saying, everything you do is great. Go ahead, keep working on that. He was very devoted to his mother, and she responded with unceasing praise and encouragement. When he decided that riflery wasn't something he wanted to do, that was fine with Henrietta. And when he complained that he hated exercising at the school gym, he defended him to his father. And when he drew animals on the attic walls and crayons with pencils that he kept at his bedside all over the floors, that was fine with Henrietta too. He showed his mother a beast from the zoo, a sketch of an animal, a beast with ears hanging down to its feet and beyond. And she said, that's wonderful. What's the name of that animal? And he said, it's called a wimp. And of course, that's what it was called. Theodore Geisel was a tall, thin boy. He looked like an angler right out of Huckleberry Finn. suitable because fishing was his pastime. His mother would sing to their children with this rhythmic chant that she used to sell the pies. And he would later say that she played a very important role in developing his interest in rhyme, words, music, etc. After his father, after Ted's grandfather died, his father's father died in 1919, Theodore, Ted's father, was appointed president of the Springfield breweries, but this position was short-lived, and eventually the sale of alcohol was made illegal in 1920, which doomed the brewery. And Ted's father was forced to change careers, so he later became the superintendent of the Forest Park Zoo. So Ted had an opportunity to visit the zoo anytime he wanted. They visited nearly every day, where he drew these unique visions of animals. Sometimes his sister would come. They very often went to the park and all the different festivals that were there. He always drew these crazy animals on the walls of his sister's bedroom just to irritate her. And eventually they were wallpapered over on the house on Fairfield Street. He had behind the scenes tours at the zoo. He would always bring a pad to sketch. He had an incredible variety of animals even before he became an adult. But not all of Ted's childhood memories were happy ones. Now, as America entered into World War I and there was prejudice against German Americans and that started to increase, Marnie and Ted had to bond together as they would find a way to cope with the taunts of others. Marnie eventually developed agoraphobia later in life because of the challenging social issues that she and Ted faced as children who were from German immigrants. As a teenager of German heritage, they absorbed a certain amount of abuse. The kids would call them drunken Kaisers. And he was determined to prove his patriotism. Now, in 1917, these are the fantastical characters that he drew when he was young. Teddy Roosevelt came to Springfield to present medals to the Boy Scouts who had sold the most thrift stamps. And Grandfather Giesel had bought off all of Ted's stash, $1,000 worth. And so easily he was placed among the top 12 boys designated to receive the medals. But as they were getting in line, he kept getting pushed to the back. When Roosevelt arrived, he sat on the stage while this famous Rough Rider made a rousing speech, and he proceeded down the line of boys, handing out medals to the first 11. And he writes, "Standing before me," Ted says, "I remember looking in his hand and he had no medals left. And the audience was filled with thousands of people, and I remember the great Teddy Roosevelt looking down at me and saying, 'What are you doing here, little boy?' He said I couldn't speak. I rose and left the stage. I was disgraced. And every time I get in front of an audience, even now," he said, "I'm too old to get psychoanalyzed out of this. I say to myself, 'What are you doing here, little boy?'" So he left Springfield in 1921, and he went to thrive at Dartmouth. The college humor magazine is where he found his first job, and that's eventually where Seuss was born. He said, "The night before Easter of my senior year, there were 10 of us gathered in my room at the Randall Club, and we had a pint of gin for 10 people. But Pa Randall called the chief, and the chief of police came himself to raid us. And we were all put on probation for defying prohibition, especially on an Easter evening. And the consequence for punishment was he could no longer function as the editor of the magazine. So in the spring of 1925, the newspaper carried a suspiciously high number of unsigned cartoons. There were also sketches by L. Burbank, Thomas Mott Osborne, those were some of his early names, D.G. Rossetti, and eventually T. Seuss, and one by Seuss times 2. Now, in his early career, he was a humorist and did ad copy for advertising. His byline was Theo Seuss II, or he called himself Dr. Theophilus Seuss, but he never, ever again returned to Ted Geisel, just in case they were following into his career. Now, eventually, Ted Geisel disappeared, and Dr. Seuss got bigger and bigger. And when a children's book entitled "And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street" by Dr. Seuss appeared in 1937, people of Springfield would say, "Remember Teddy Geisel? I think that's by him. That's his book." For another half century, the folks in Springfield would be saying that 47 more times. Teddy Geisel's got another book out. He was only known by Teddy Geisel in Springfield. He was eventually lured back in 1986 on the occasion of their 350th anniversary, and there were 600 children there who wrote letters to him begging him to come and visit. And he was presented with a sign that said Geisel Grove. He had a street named after him. It was hung in Forest Park where he had picnicked with his family. And he visited Mulberry Street in his boyhood bedroom, and he said, "I fell asleep to the howling of wolves at the zoo when I was in this room, and behind that wallpaper, you'll find holes that I gouged into the wall with a pencil so I could see the fantastic animals that were hiding behind the walls." He read a lot as a child. He loves books. He loved to use creative language and humor. And his creativity with both words and images began to emerge in his high school years. At Central High School, he enjoyed the many extracurricular activities and started submitting his work to the school newspaper, the Central Recorder. He also published a parody on Walt Whitman's "O Captain, My Captain," calling it "O Latin, My Latin." This is the story. You could look it up online. It's kind of an interesting, clever, little whimsical rhyme. He was 14 when he wrote this piece because of the dreadful feeling that he got of going into Latin class. Eventually, he was the news editor for the Recorder. He wrote books about, or reports about school debate club and other events. He developed his skills while he was in high school as a writer. And his clever sense of wit emerged in one-line jokes that were called Ted's Grinds. He wrote those in the newspaper. He was the joke editor for the high school yearbook. He also drew cartoons and wrote a short paragraph under the name Pete the Pessimist. That was his first pseudonym during his high school years. He also signed a satire that's pretty famously known called The Pupil's Nightmare, where it appeared in the Recorder January 21st, 1920, and his name on that one was T.S. LeSieg, that's seagull backwards. And he used that a few times when he published his first books before he really fully took on Dr. Seuss. In his yearbook, his fellow classmates voted him best class artist and most wit. He was certainly endeared these titles because people would always write about how funny and artistic he was. One of the educators at Central High School recognized Ted's talent and encouraged him to write, and that's where Ted Geisel felt that he got his first ideas to go in that direction and continue developing his writing skills. Schoolmates were always entertained by his stories and his cartoons. Even when he was only 12 years old, he was writing these cartoons that would make people laugh, and he'd win awards for these cartoons. Later, he would say, "High school was my first Big Bang year. And a teacher wanted me to draw the world as he saw it, but I wanted to draw things the way I saw it, so I flunked my art classes over and over. Eventually, I quit those classes." He eventually went on to draw things his own way. Now, his art teacher told him he would never succeed as an artist, he should stick to writing. He always broke the conventional rules of drawing, and that's when he transferred out of all art classes and never attended any. The negative comment from the teacher didn't stop him. However, he did do his extracurricular activities to develop his artistic talent. And he continued drawing during college and graduate courses at Oxford. He filled the margins of his notebooks with doodles, no formal drawing classes for Teddy. After he returned from Europe in 1927, he set up his drawing board and typewriter at his father's desk after he went to Oxford for extended classes. And he began creating humorous pieces and cartoons and eventually sent them to a number of New York editors in hopes of finding a job. Finally, in June of 1927, he received word that the Saturday Evening Post was interested in one of his cartoons, and Judge Magazine had purchased one of them to put on the cover of their magazine, a magazine that was going to be a local periodical for Springfield. The publication was July 16, 1927. It's the first time he signed his name Seuss. He was excited about the launch of his career, and he took that $25 check that he got from these two cartoons, and he moved to New York. He enjoyed music and theater from an early age, and his home always included a music parlor. He was always joined in the company of the church organist at the studio above Court Square. He was always promised that he would go and get his books first and then go to his music lessons. It inspired him later to become a pianist because his mother always wanted him to play piano. And he eventually wrote a book called The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. And it turned into a musical screenplay about a boy who was forced to take piano lessons. His musical talent also extended into popular string instruments of the time. He played banjo, and he was in the mandolin club. He loved theater, he loved to perform. He even wrote some of his own theatrical works during his high school years. And in a letter of recommendation that was sent to Dartmouth College, his high school principal said, "I remember him best as bringing down the house in a comedy work." And that was his natural gift, humor. He continued to sharpen his wit and his creative skills while he was in college at Dartmouth and in New Hampshire, and eventually in his graduate courses. Now, when America declared war against Germany on April 6, 1917, he was only 13 years old at the time, but it was overnight that this proud German-American family was now shunned by friends and neighbors. There was this hatred and discrimination against German Americans. It was witnessed all over Springfield, and many German books were actually removed from the libraries, and this made a deep, lasting impression on him. The discrimination that he encountered as a teen had a deep influence on his later children's books. Many who have studied Dr. Seuss feel that it was probably most evident in this book called The Sneetchers. And it's a group of Sneetchers who have stars on their bellies, and they discriminate against the Sneetchers who don't have stars on their bellies. When Ted was a child in Springfield, he used to love to visit his grandparents' bakery in Springfield, and he loved the smell of fresh baked bread. And a short distance away was the gasworks, which was a large plant emitting foul odors, belching out this black smoke from the 4 large smokestacks, and it would interfere with the smell of this bread. And we don't know how young he was when he reacted to pollution, but it became something that was important to him. And about 50 years later, he wrote the book The Lorax about pollution and its tragic effects. In 1937, in the midst of the Great Depression, 24 publishers rejected this book, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, which was the first children's book by Theodore Geisel, but not Marshall McClintock. He was a classmate and an editor of Vanguard Press, and he actually ran into him on the street and Ted mentioned to him how frustrated he was that he had been turned down with this book. So to thank McClintock for eventually publishing it, he not only dedicated the book to McClintock's wife, Helene, but the main character is Marco, their son. And that kind of strengthened his communication and relationship that he had with the Dartmouth alumni for many, many years. Incidentally, classmates would often find him asleep in the magazine office with his head down on the typewriter. That's how a lot of people remember him. And then the book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, which is still on the Amazon's bestseller list, was a common greeting at Dartmouth. Ted's mother eventually passes away, so let's take a look at the chronological order of his death, and the significant events that he wrote in a memoir were the things that changed his life. So in the 1930s, his mother eventually passes away. at the age of 52 from an inoperable brain tumor. And he had just turned 27 at the time, but it was terribly upsetting because he was very close with her. So in 1934, he begins creating a series of mixed media sculptures that he called Unorthodox Taxidermy, which incorporated real animal parts like beaks and antlers and horns from deceased animals that his father would bring home from the zoo. And he eventually published his first book during this time, which was called The Pocket Book of Boners. And it's all about all the mistakes people made. Boner was, of course, it was about silly, incorrect answers that were given by children from a variety of different sources. So, for example, the book was full of risque adult illustrations and comments, but only adults would really get it. One comment in it was about a boy who answers a question about when a Northern soldier couldn't go into the Civil War, what did they do? And he said, they send a prostitute. So this was in this cartoon book. Okay, in the 40s, Horton hatches an egg, and that's published. It's an engaging story about an elephant up in a tree. It was enthusiastically received as the result of the book's success. That's when he decided he wanted to become a children's author. And then he begins these creative political cartoons in response to the growing concern about the war and Hitler's rise to power, and he turns his attention from writing children's books to producing more than 400 political cartoons. So these are the stepping stones in Ted's life that he felt had him change his way and move his direction, that were the things that were significant. Now, around 1942, this is where he wanted to be as a political illustrator, and he produces drawings in an effort to aid the war effort. He also created war bond posters, and then he eventually joins the Army as a captain, and he serves as a commander of the animation department of the 1st Motion Picture Unit of the Army of the Air Force, and he writes scripts for military propaganda films. And then his world, he said, takes me into a different direction. And like in many of Seuss's books, Horton Hears a Who was not just about the elephant hearing a tiny voice, but it was an allegory for America's treatment of post-war Japan. The small country needed the support of a large country to get back on its feet after the devastation of World War II. And so he wrote about Horton's plight with the Who after a trip where he went to Hiroshima and saw the devastation there. And he dedicated it to a young man that he met in Japan who he vowed to draw this attention to the Americans. He became friends with him, and he was going to do something to bring his plight into view. He also admitted that this story, Yertle the Turtle, is based on Hitler. Did anybody know that? So the power-hungry turtle was a direct representation of the dictator, but that wasn't the big controversy of the book. What ended up being controversial was the fact that the turtle, who was on the bottom and always on the bottom, wanted to be heard, so he lets out this big burp. That had never happened in a book before, especially a children's book, so the publisher made him take it out. Then in March of 1947, he wins an Academy Award for a documentary, a film called Design for Death, which was a study of Japanese culture. And it was based on a U.S. training film, and it was co-authored by his wife, Helen Palmer Geisel. It's a documentary of fabulous proportions. One of the most interesting screen presentations of the year is what was said at the Academy Awards about this film. In '48, Thudwick, The Big-Hearted Moose, is published, and it taught the importance of self-respect through a story about a kind-hearted moose who is taken advantage of by unwanted guests who took up residence in his antlers. And that's when he realized that people really wanted to read stories about truth. So in 1951, not only was he a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, he won 2 Academy Awards. The first one I mentioned. The second one was a short called Gerald McBoing Boing. Again, you have to look this up. on YouTube. It's absolutely hysterical. The only thing this little boy says is noises, and he winds up finding a way to integrate into the world with this unusual talent. I wish I could play it here. I can't seem to integrate it. I'm going to figure out a way to do that. And then On Beyond Zebra is published also in the 50s, and it's a concoction of all the new Seussian words. And he had actually invented a 20-letter alphabet so that these words could be spelled. Then in 57, his world turned around. The Cat in the Hat was published, and he wrote this in response to yet another challenge, that he write a book for first graders that they can't put down, but only using 225 words. And The Cat in the Hat resulted in being a story that usurped completely the Dick and Jane books because they were so boring, and reading levels were down in schools because the kids refused to read these boring books. And so, challenged by his publisher, they wanted him to write a book that would help children to read so that they would once again enjoy reading again. So the director at the Houghton Mifflin company that publishes the books gave him a list of 350 words that every child should know by the time they're in second grade. And so of those words, he chose 250 of them, but in the end, he only used 220 of the most used words by children, the ones that they needed to know by the time they got into second grade. And the impressive sales of this book helped him to launch this whole beginner's book series, which was eventually designed to combat the growing problem of literacy in America by helping children want to read. Then in 57, he published How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which was a way to reflect on his views of commercialism. And Grinch became a holiday standard. The Cat in the Hat comes back, is eventually published. Incidentally, I love these little facts that I found here and there. The guy who sings that, "You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch," was the same guy who had the voice of Tony the Tiger. Remember Tony the Tiger, the cereal? Now, Seuss's wife, Helen, was the reason that he became an artist and that he followed through on his dreams. And while they were in colleges when they met, and she encouraged him not only to settle for a career of something he desired, but don't go with a safe career as a teacher, but she pushed him into his dreams as a cartoonist and a writer. She felt that he had a farther reach if he did it through his books rather than thinking about teaching. Now, unfortunately, later in life, Seuss cheated on her while she was dying of cancer. And on the throes of death, the day before she actually passed away, he slipped out of the house with a younger woman, Audrey Stone Diamond, a longtime friend of both him and his wife. And when Helen found out, she was heartbroken. And the pain was too much for her to bear, so in anguish, after 30 years of marriage, she committed suicide. And within a year, he married his mistress, and he stayed with her until he died. In the 60s, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish is one of the most well-loved beginner books, and he starts becoming more interested in phonics, and it's evident through the text. Green Eggs and Ham is published. Again, Bennett Cerf challenges him to see if he could do yet another book, 50 words, short amount of words. Green Eggs and Ham is exactly 50 words and only 50 words, telling the tale of Sam I Am, and it became a very popular book. He said this is his favorite book, and it made him laugh when he would read it. Now, Ted and Audrey eventually joined the 50th reunion at Dartmouth, which was kind of a retrospective of his work. And at this point, he was starting to lose his sight and struggling with glaucoma. So he writes this book on the event of his visit to Dartmouth called I Can Read With My Eyes Shut. When the Lorax was published, it incorporated a message about the importance of saving the environment and preserving natural resources. And the illustrations of the factories, which appear in the book, are very similar to the industrial buildings that he saw in Springfield. And he believed that the truffula trees were based on the flowering dogwoods that he had in Forest Park. He visited Springfield for the first time since his father died 20 years earlier. And during that visit, children were yelling out to him, "We love you, Dr. Seuss." The Butter Battle book is published on Ted's 80th birthday, and it's a cautionary tales about the perils of nuclear arms, the race, the public opinion, the controversy, and it also made the bestseller list. And then he receives a Pulitzer Prize, and he's recognized for his contribution over near a half a century to education and the enjoyment of America's children and their parents, which brought him to new heights of fame and celebrity. This was one of the more adult content cartoons that he created during this time. He had a little power and he kind of ran with it. If you see in the corner, that little boy is reading the book, The Facts of Life, and he says, "Gad, Emma, this stuff's dynamite." Then in 1990, he wanted kids to start reading early, so he intended for this book to be read when they were still in womb with their mothers. And it was meant to be read in utero, and "Oh, the Places You Go" was supposed to rhyme with being read in utero. And it's supposed to introduce children to these Seuss characters so that they'll eventually read when they come out. Coincidentally, it's the best-selling book now because so many people give it as a graduation gift. This book sells about 300,000 copies every year because people give it to college and high school graduates. Eventually, he passes away at the age of 87. After his death was reported on the morning of September 25th, 1991, he became front page news of hundreds of newspapers all around Springfield and the world. There was a commemorative newspaper published in just about every city. Then in the year 2000, the National Memorial, Dr. Seuss National Memorial Sculpture Garden opened to the public in 2002. And it was created by Ted's stepdaughter and a noted artist. Her name is Lark Gray Diamond Cates. And the sculptural garden is located on the beautifully landscaped grounds of the Springfield Museum properties. It's larger than life. It's incredible. Has anybody ever seen these gardens in Springfield? Definitely worth the trip. His books continue to be popular with new generations of children, adding to his growing stature as an icon of children's literature. But despite the unprecedented demand during his lifetime, no limited edition artworks were ever conceived or authorized or created until 1997, 6 years after his death, when someone had mentioned that maybe his artwork would be valuable. That year, Audrey put together into motion a series of artworks and exhibitions that would carry out this promise that she had to Ted that he would become established as an iconic artist, not just a children's book illustrator. His artwork became the platform from which he delivered the children's books, over 400 World War II political cartoons, hundreds of advertisements, countless editorials, all filled with wonderfully inventive animals, characters, and a lot of clever humor. He single-handedly forged a new genre of art that falls somewhere between the surrealist movement of the early 20th century and this inspired nonsense of child's classroom doodles that's Dr. Seuss's alone. These are the mystery paintings behind Dr. Seuss's secret life. You've got to take a look at them. There's hundreds of them. And the gallery in Chicago, incidentally, is extraordinary of his artwork. A lot of quotes about Dr. Seuss. I know all the teachers in the crowd probably use them all the time. I love, this is one of my favorites. You know you're in love when you can't fall asleep because the reality is finally better than your dreams. And then, of course, this is one of his more famous ones. We're all a little weird. Life's a little weird. And when we find someone whose weirdness is compatible with ours, we join up with them and fall in mutual weirdness, and then we call it love. And that's why we love Dr. Seuss. Any questions? Well, I hope you learned something new, maybe a couple new things. Found an interest in Dr. Seuss as an artist as well as a writer and illustrator and ad man. And I look forward to seeing you at our next lecture.
Thank you.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the Through the Eyes of the Artist series for the citizens of Hudson. Thanks also to Hudson's own Felicia Zavarella Stadelman for sharing her vast art history knowledge via her Through the Eyes of the Artist series.